Today's topic is about the basics of logic, and even though it's basic, I bet you will find it difficult to understand. Ready to accept the challenge? Well, here is Louis Woodson Stanley Sr. He was a simple Georgia boy, but a thinking man as well. He used to chop wood with the axe that you see right here in my hand. Don't get nervous, there's a point here, okay? I often chop wood in my suburban backyard for the fireplace during the winter. When I do, I tell my children about how it used to belong to their great-grandfather and how he joined the Coast Guard at only 17. In his 30s, he adopted 3 boys to give them a life of opportunity that they had been denied. One of those boys was my father. His dad was an expert at farming and farm tools that he used to clear fallen trees and brush, just like the axe I showed you. The 22-acre family property was very important to him, but over the years, the head of the axe became chipped, dulled, and blunted. Eventually, even sharpening it wasn't enough and it had to be replaced. Now, the handle itself requires replacement too, but the axe only has 2 parts, the head and the handle. After I replace the handle, will it still be my grandfather's axe? This question challenges the very core of philosophy, the law of identity, and Plutarch in his day had no problem stirring up trouble when it came to philosophy. The only way to address that challenge, and a few philosophical questions even more challenging than that, which we'll get to shortly, is with reason. I'm Robert Stanley, and this is The Right to Reason. Plutarch's original analogy was of Theseus's ship. Each board and nail of his ship had been replaced as time went on, so Plutarch asked, is it still the ship of Theseus? The question narrows in on one of the 3 basic absolutes of logic, the law of identity, the first one. And if you can't get this right, you can't do logic. It's simple, A equals A. But it doesn't sound so simple when we dip Plutarch's question into philosophy like a litmus test, right? Have you figured out the answer yet? If you're listening to this with a friend, your friend would probably disagree with you about whether or not it's my grandfather's axe or whether it's Theseus's ship still. You can't both be right. And therefore, one of you must be wrong. Well, the answer reduces down to the difficult fact that words, as well as identity, are attributed to objects, and therefore words don't have meanings. I know both Merriam and Webster are turning over in their graves right now, but that's just what philosophy does. It challenges the dead. Instead of meanings, words have usages. That which we attribute identity to changes just like how we use words. If you were joyfully singing in the rain back in 1952 like Gene Kelly, all right, one might call you gay, but today the term gay means something entirely different. Well, actually, that's still kind of gay. Anyway, speaking of Merriam-Webster, they define logic as the science of the formal principles of reasoning and identity, and just the first law is identity. It's followed by the law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle. The law of non-contradiction states that contradictory statements cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time, e.g. the 2 propositions A is B and A is not B are mutually exclusive. Seems easy enough, right? The third and final law is excluded middle, which says everything must either be or not be. Therefore, A cannot be A and not A simultaneously. To simplify this, let's say everything is what it is, everything isn't what it isn't, and everything can't be neither or both. These fundamental absolutes dictate every logical conclusion that can possibly be formulated. The cool thing about these laws is that the only way one could refute them would be to use the laws of logic to argue against the laws of logic. It can't be done, and would be a logical fallacy in itself. The form of argument is known as reductio ad absurdum, which is Latin for reducing something to the point of being absurd. In the 1500s, people were confident that heavy things fell faster than light things. It seems intuitively plausible, right? If you drop a feather and a bowling ball off the top of the Empire State Building, which one hits the ground first? The bowling ball, of course. However, we know that the feather is reacting to air resistance, which in fluid dynamics is known as drag, But what if we drop them simultaneously in a vacuum? You guessed right, they fall at the exact same time. Galileo proved this with philosophy long before science ever could by using reductio ad absurdum. He asked, if heavy things do fall faster than light things, then what if we took a big rock and a little rock and tied them together with a string before dropping them? The little rock would act like drag and should then slow the big heavy rock down as it falls. But this immediately sounds absurd because two rocks are always going to be heavier than one rock. The story is one of the most classical arguments in logic of all time. There are other classic arguments that you've probably heard before, just like this one.
To eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Let's just stick to what we know, yes? Stick to the facts.
Once you've ruled out the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be true.
What does that mean?
Classic Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, right? There's only one problem. It's wrong. If you're sure of all variables and referring to something easy like, where did I leave my car keys? Then this might be useful. For example, you know you left your car keys either in the car, on the nightstand, or in the refrigerator, okay? You check the car and you check the nightstand, so your keys must be in the refrigerator. Easy, I mean weird, but okay. The problem is that you often don't know all the possible variables when dealing with a logical problem, and you could be very wrong about what you claim to be impossible. This would actually be a logical fallacy known as the argument from ignorance. Doesn't mean you're ignorant, that's just the name of it, okay? It's pretty much stating, I can't think of anything else that it could be, so therefore it must be this. That's not the first time Sherlock Holmes pretended to do logic and failed to understand its principles. What's that little word palace method that he uses to solve crimes? Deduction, right? Remember? Sherlock Holmes, deduction? Well, deduction attains conclusions that must necessarily follow from universal premises. It's top-down logic, all right? Induction, however, is the inference from particular instances, like figuring out how the victim was killed by analyzing the clues around the room. The third form of reasoning is abduction, which will aid you in determining what is most probable and is useful when trying to identify who most likely performed the murder. So Sherlock uses induction and abduction rather than deduction. Movies are often illogical, like how destroying a computer screen seems to always destroy the actual computer program.
Your death amounts to the same as your life, a zero sum. Rated EC10.
You cannot save John Connor.
Watch me.
Another one is that a small fire lights the entire room.
Come out to the coast, we'll get together, have a few laughs.
And finally, of course, how the bomb's countdown always tends to be stopped right at the last second.
3, 2, 1.
It always stops at 1 on the show.
But logic itself doesn't sound as logical as you might think. It's actually based on assumptions. No logic can be done without first accepting the three basic logical assumptions. Reality exists, you can learn something about reality, and models with predictive capability are more useful than models without. These foundations of logic can't be demonstrated and therefore make logic itself improvable unless you presuppose these assumptions to be true. This presents the question of hard solipsism, which is that the self is all that can be known to exist. You could just be creating everything you experience and everyone you know right inside your own head. At least you can know that you exist. Perhaps you recall the classical axiom cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But Friedrich Nietzsche disproved René Descartes' proposition by pointing out that he is presupposing the self when starting off his argument with the subject pronoun I, and then using that to prove that he is. In Latin, that fallacy is known as principio principii, or begging the question. Descartes was attempting to focus on doubting his existence, and about 100 years later, Antoine Leonard Thomas aptly captures Descartes' intent with the rephrasing dubito ergo cogito ergo sum, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. At the end of the day, it's important to remember that all logic comes from doubt, and without skepticism, we can't even reason. So to recap, we've learned about the laws of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle. We've cracked the misunderstood code of meaning versus usages. We've discussed reductio ad absurdum and Galileo. We talked about the differences between deduction, induction, and abduction. We've covered the 3 basic logical assumptions, then discovered that you may be all that exists, and finally, that you don't even know if that's really true. Perhaps the only thing that we can really know for sure is that I'm smarter than Sherlock Holmes. Hey, I hope you learned something interesting today. You can see more videos by subscribing to my YouTube channel. You can also listen to the entirety of the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or even Podbean. These video topics are only short segments taken from the actual broadcast. You can also support us at patreon.com/right, like our page on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter at Right to Reason 1. If you forgot any of that stuff and you don't want to get murdered by my axe today, you can follow all those links, amongst lots of other cool stuff, at therighttoreason.com.